My name is Arthur Blackwood, and for 49 years, I have committed a sin to prevent a nightmare. This isn't a story I ever wanted to tell, but I'm 82 now, and the time for secrets is over. Since the long, brutal winter of 1975, I have been feeding the thing that haunts these woods, the creature the old stories call Wendigo. A pact, you might call it, a terrible bargain I made to keep it from wandering south, to keep it from the towns, from the highways. From you, it was a simple trade, a portion of my hunt in exchange for its silence, in exchange for its staying sated, staying hidden. But this is not a story of success. This is a confession. Because yesterday, for the first time in nearly 5 decades, it stopped eating. The silence is broken, not by noise, but by a new, more profound emptiness. I'm telling you this now because I believe I have doomed us all. And you deserve to know the shape of the thing that is coming for you. You need to understand the hunger I failed to contain. I am the last resident of the last Loon Lodge, a name that feels more like a prophecy with each passing year. The lodge sits on a tract of land that straddles the Minnesota-Canada border, a place the maps mark with caution, and most people avoid entirely. I inherited this isolation after my younger brother, Daniel, vanished in a blizzard back in the winter of '74. He went out hunting and never came back. They called off the search after a week. I never did. The people in the nearest town, a 2-hour snowmobile ride away, think I'm just a crazy old recluse, a hermit hoarding his grief. I let them believe it. In fact, I encouraged it. That reputation is a wall, you see. A fortress I built, brick by painful brick, to keep people out, to keep them safe. It was the first rule of my new life. No one gets close. Proximity is a risk I couldn't afford, a liability the pact would not tolerate. And for 49 years, that wall has held. Until now, you need to believe that I'm sane. You need to understand that my world is one of cold, hard reality. So let me ground you in it. My life is a constant rhythm of logistics, a battle for survival measured in numbers. I check the propane levels for the stove daily. A miscalculation means a slow, cold death. The low, constant hum of the diesel generator is the only sound that connects me to the 21st century. My only source of power. I have to make it last. Twice a season, just twice, I make the long, dangerous journey to town by snowmobile to haul back supplies. Every can of beans, every box of ammunition, every gallon of fuel has to be precisely calculated to fit. There's no room for error, no calling for a delivery. Out here, you are your own rescuer. The primary sound of this place isn't the generator though, it's the silence. A deep, heavy quiet that presses in on you. A physical weight on your eardrums. It's a silence you pay for. The silence is punctuated only by the sounds of the world slowly breaking under pressure. The deep, groaning sigh of the lake ice as it shifts and settles. A sound like a sleeping giant turning over in its bed. The sharp, gunshot crack of a pine branch, heavy with snow, finally giving way and surrendering to gravity. I know this cold not as a temperature, but as a physical presence. It's an entity that seeps into the walls of the cabin and into the very marrow of your bones. The ache in my joints is a more reliable weather vane than any broadcast meteorologist. I can feel a storm coming in the throb of my left knee 3 hours before the first snowflake falls. This place writes its story on your body, etching its laws into your flesh and sinew. You don't conquer this land. You don't even survive it. You simply learn to endure its terms, to read its subtle language of pain and pressure, and hope it tolerates your presence for one more day. My guilt over Daniel is just as constant as the cold, just as sharp as the ache in my bones. It's the ghost that truly haunts this lodge. He was younger, more adventurous. I was supposed to be the responsible one. I should have been with him on that hunt. He'd asked me to go, but I was nursing a foolish pride from some small argument we'd had the night before. "I'll be back by dinner," he said, and he smiled that easy smile of his. That failure, that single, selfish decision to stay behind, is what brought me here. I came to take over the search when the professionals gave up, and the guilt is what kept me here. I couldn't leave him out there alone in the wilderness, even if all that was left was a memory. This lodge became my penance, my self-imposed exile. I was tending to his legacy, or so I told myself. The truth is, I was waiting, I didn't know what for, not then. I just knew I couldn't leave. That failure was the seed, the dark soil from which this entire nightmare grew. The pact, as I call it, began that first winter after he was gone. The winter of 75. And last night, the pact was broken. My ritual has been the same for longer than many of you have been alive. Every 3 days, without fail, I leave an offering. It's usually a salted deer haunch, sometimes a quarter of a moose, a significant portion of any animal I hunt. I place it on a large, flat-topped granite slab, a natural altar about 300 yards into the tree line, just where the dense pines begin to swallow the light. It's a place I never approach after the sun begins to set. That is one of the most important rules, a line I have never, ever crossed. The offering is always made in the fading light of the afternoon. You leave it, you turn your back, and you do not look back. You walk away and trust that the silence you hear behind you is the sound of your payment being accepted. You feed the silence, not the beast. It's a phrase I've repeated to myself 1,000 times. This morning, I woke up before the dawn, as I always do. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. Not the usual peaceful quiet I had bought with my offering, but a different kind of silence. A hungry, listening silence. The air itself felt sharp, thin, expectant. I pulled on my boots and my heavy coat, the familiar ritual of preparing to face the cold. I went to my window that overlooks the tree line, the one I've stared out of every morning for 49 years. I raised my binoculars to my eyes, the cold metal a shock against my skin, and I saw it. Or rather, I saw what was still there. The deer haunch, it was sitting on the granite slab, perfectly untouched. A light dusting of fresh snow from the early morning flurries coated it like a powdered shroud. It was frozen solid, a monument to my failure. A dark shape against the stark white snow. A question mark aimed directly at my heart. In that moment, the world I had so carefully constructed began to fracture. An untouched offering is not just a refusal of food. It's a message. It's a statement of intent. For 5 decades, that exchange has been the metronome that governs my life. The one constant in a world of variables. My work, my safety, the very sanity I cling to. All of it is predicated on that offering being accepted. When it's gone in the morning, it means the pact holds. It means the hunger is contained. It means the silence is peaceful. But this was different. This was a calculating silence. The absence of sound was filled with a terrible purpose. I felt watched, not by a simple predator, but by an intelligence that was actively choosing to communicate its displeasure. It wasn't that it wasn't hungry. That was the most terrifying thought. It was still hungry. It had just decided my offering was no longer sufficient. It was hungry for something else, something more. And the silence was its way of telling me to guess what that was. A test I could not afford to fail. Panic is a cold fire. It burns away reason. My first instinct was to barricade myself inside, to pile furniture against the door and pray. But that's not how you survive out here. That's not how you honor the rules of this place. The hunger has rules. I've learned that much. And a broken pact requires a response. You cannot show weakness. You cannot hide. Hiding is an admission of guilt, an invitation for it to come closer, to test the walls of your home, to whisper your brother's name on the wind. I stood there by the window for what felt like an eternity, the untouched offering burning a hole in my vision. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. Twilight, the forbidden time. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. For the first time in 49 years, I broke my most sacred rule. I decided to walk toward the offering slab as darkness began to bleed across the snow. Every step I took was a betrayal. My boots, crunching on the crisp snow, sounded like sacrilege in the profound quiet. It was a deafening noise, a declaration that I was crossing a line that had been drawn in blood and time. The air grew colder, heavier, as I left the relative safety of the clearing around my cabin. The trees loomed over me like silent judges. With every yard I covered, the feeling of being watched intensified until it was a physical pressure on the back of my neck. My breath plumed in front of me, a fleeting ghost in the dying light. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark shape of the meat on the stone, forcing myself not to scan the impenetrable shadows between the pines. You do not seek it out. You do not acknowledge its presence. You feed the silence, not the beast. But I was no longer feeding the silence. I was walking into it. I was challenging it. I was a frail old man marching toward a god he had just insulted, with no weapon and no plan. Only a question I was too terrified to ask aloud. I am telling you this because the rules have changed. The agreement that kept the nightmare at bay is void. I don't know if I'll survive the night to tell you the rest, but the story must be told. The truth of what lives in the deep, cold places of this world needs a voice, and I am the last one left who can give it. I'm not asking you to come find me. I'm asking you to listen, to bear witness. The story of what happened next. The story of the pact itself, of the messages it left, of the things I saw. It's more important than my life. It's the only thing that matters now. I am breaking my silence so that you may understand yours. If this story has found you, if you feel that chill down your spine, then you're already a part of it. If you want to know what this creature is, and why it has finally turned its gaze toward the wider world, please, stay with me. Like this confession, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's coming, and share this warning. You need to hear this to the end, to understand the ritual. You have to go back to the beginning, back to that first winter of pure, undiluted terror in 1975. I was snowed in, running low on firewood, and my grief for Daniel was a physical sickness. I was living inside a ghost story of my own making. Then the scratching started. It wasn't the sound of an animal, not a bear or a raccoon. It was a thin, skeletal sound, like a single, sharp fingernail being dragged slowly across the outer walls of the cabin. It would start at one corner and move, with a horrifying deliberation, all the way to the other. And with it came the whispers on the wind. The blizzard was howling, and the wind can play tricks on a lonely man's mind. I know, but it sounded so much like my brother's voice, it shattered what was left of my sanity. Arthur, it would sigh, a sound that seemed to slip through the cracks in the window frames. It's so cold out here, night after night. The psychological assault continued. I'd be huddled by the wood stove, my shotgun resting across my lap, convinced the door was about to splinter and fly off its hinges. The scratching would get more frantic, more insistent. One night, my nerve finally broke, and I peered through a small knothole in the wooden shutters. In the swirling chaos of the blizzard, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the tree line. It was impossibly tall and thin, like a dead tree that had been stripped of its bark and sharpened to a point. It moved with a horrifying, disjointed grace that didn't belong to any living thing. It swayed in the wind, but not with the wind. It was a silhouette of pure starvation, a pillar of hunger against the white chaos. That image is burned onto the back of my eyelids. It is the shape of all my fears given form. I couldn't take it anymore. The scratching, the voice, the shape in the storm. It was a siege designed to break my mind. In a fit of pure animal desperation, I stumbled out to the small, uninsulated porch, where I kept frozen cuts of meat. My hands, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with a thick, frost-covered steak. It was a significant part of my dwindling food supply, but survival had been redefined in those last few hours. It was no longer about starving or freezing. It was about keeping that thing out. I unbolted the heavy cabin door, threw the frozen steak as far as I could into the swirling snow, and slammed the door shut again, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I leaned against the door, listening. For the first time in days, the scratching stopped. The whispering on the wind died down. There was only the sound of the storm. The next morning, I awoke to a world transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a profound and perfect silence. A true, peaceful silence I hadn't known since Daniel had walked out that door for the last time. It was the absence of that scratching, that whispering, that gave the quiet its quality. It felt clean, sacred. I crept to the window, half expecting to see the thing still standing there. But the woods were just woods, and the snow. The snow was a pristine, unbroken blanket, except for the spot where I had thrown the steak. It was gone. Not just taken, but gone. There were no tracks leading to it, no signs of a struggle, no blood. It was as if a piece of the world had been surgically removed without leaving a scar. In that moment, the pact was born. I had, by sheer accident, found the answer. I had stumbled upon the currency of this cold, hungry place. That accident became the engine of my new life. The raw, directionless terror was replaced by a grim, focused purpose. Managing the pact, I began to understand. This wasn't an act of simple malice or a haunting. It was about hunger. A profound, elemental hunger that was as much a part of this landscape as the ice and the pines. And if it was hunger, it had rules. It could be reasoned with, in a way. It could be bargained with. This realization was more terrifying and, in a strange way, more comforting than any ghost story. It meant my survival and my sanity wasn't a matter of chance. It was now a matter of logistics, of payment, of ritual. And one, Arthur Blackwood, the grieving brother, the failed protector, became its keeper. The hunger has rules, I whispered to myself then, a mantra that would guide my every action for the next 5 decades. The rules of this silent contract were not written down. They were learned through a slow, terrifying process of trial and error. The flat granite slab, a natural formation 300 yards out, became the designated place of exchange. I tried leaving the offering closer to the cabin once, just 50 yards out, thinking it might be more convenient. That night, the scratching returned. It was light, almost questioning, but it was there, a clear complaint. I didn't sleep a wink. The next day, I left the offering at the slab, the full 300 yards away. The scratching stopped. The rule was clear. It required a buffer zone. It was defining its territory, and by extension, it was defining mine. The land between my cabin and that stone became a kind of sacrosanct no-man's land that neither of us would cross uninvited. The rule about not watching was learned in an even more chilling fashion. A few months into the pact, my human curiosity, my need to see asterisk, got the better of me. I left a fresh deer quarter on the slab and, instead of walking back to the cabin, I circled around and hid behind a thicket of firs, my binoculars raised. I waited, the sun went down. The woods remained utterly silent and still. Nothing happened. The offering sat there all night, untouched. The next day, the scratching was back, but it wasn't a complaint. It was a punishment. It was loud, angry, splintering. It sounded like it was actively testing the logs of my home, searching for a weak point. I understood then, this was not a performance to be observed. The pact required my faith, my deliberate ignorance. It demanded to be unseen. And the most important rule of all, the one that governed my entire existence, you never, ever miss an offering. There was a week in the spring of 76, when a sudden late thaw turned the entire landscape into an impassable swamp of mud and melting snow. I couldn't hunt. My stored supplies were running dangerously low. I missed the 3-day deadline by a single, agonizing day. That night, the whispering returned, but it was different. It wasn't just Daniel's voice anymore. It was a chorus. A dozen faint, desperate whispers on the wind, each telling a story of starvation. So hungry, they sighed. So cold, it was a tapestry of every soul this wilderness had ever claimed. The pact, I learned, was not a casual arrangement. It was a debt, and the interest on a late payment was a piece of my sanity. Some debts are paid in flesh, one way or another. The first definitive proof of its intelligence came a year later, an event that shifted my understanding from dealing with a beast to dealing with a mind. Poachers sometimes ventured onto the edges of these lands, and I'd found an old, rusted bear trap they'd left behind. Out of a grim sense of stewardship, I'd cleaned it, oiled it, and reset it near my property line. Far from the offering slab, a few weeks later, I went to check on it. The massive steel jaws of the trap were snapped shut, clamped powerfully on nothing but empty air. And laid neatly, precisely, across the metal trigger plate was a single, long, coarse hair, the color of ash. It hadn't just avoided the trap, it had disarmed it and then left me a calling card. It was a message, delivered with cold, undeniable clarity. Asterisk, I see your world. I understand its mechanics. Do not test me, asterisk, that single grey hair was a statement of power. It was an act of intellect that chilled me far more than any ghostly whisper or scratching in the night. An animal gets caught. An animal flees a strange object. But this was an analysis. It had observed me, or perhaps others like me, long enough to understand the function of a spring-loaded trap. It had then chosen not only to demonstrate its knowledge, but to leave physical evidence of its passage, a quiet assertion of its dominance over the tools of my world. I carefully took the hair, wrapped it in my handkerchief, and locked it away in the small metal box where I kept Daniel's pocket knife and compass. It felt like holding a piece of a fallen meteorite, something alien and powerful that I had no right to possess or understand. My pact wasn't with a simple predator. It was with an ancient, patient, and calculating mind. Then came the gesture that broke me, the one that turned this pact of fear into something far more complex, something akin to a bond. It was a few weeks after the incident with the bear trap. I made my usual journey to the slab, my heart still unsettled by the implications of the grey hair. The offering of meat I'd left 3 days prior was gone, as usual. But this time, something had been left in its place. Sitting in the center of the cold, dark stone, pale and small against the granite, was a little bird, whittled from a piece of birch wood. It was crudely carved, but the shape was unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful knot of disbelief and sorrow. It was carved in the exact, peculiar style that Daniel had always used. A specific way he had of shaping the wings to look like they were in mid-flap, a style no one else on this earth could possibly know. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. The wood was smooth, almost unnaturally so, and felt strangely warm against my cold skin. I stood there for a long time, turning the small wooden bird over and over in my gloved fingers, the silence of the forest pressing in on me. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It felt like a communication, a response. A piece of my own lost past. My deepest wound had been returned to me by this impossible creature. How could it know? The question was a terrifying abyss that opened up at my feet. Had it found Daniel? Was this a piece of him? Or was it something else, something even more profound and disturbing? Was it accessing my own memories, my grief? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. I pocketed the small bird, its smooth shape a heavy, solid presence against my leg. My heart, which had been a cold stone of grief for a year, now felt like a heavy stone of a different kind of stone of purpose. That little bird became the secret within the secret, a mystery I couldn't share with anyone. It was the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never leave this place. My role had changed. I was no longer just a warden, a zookeeper for a monster, bribing it to stay away. I was now a keeper of a mystery, the sole curator of a silent dialogue that spanned the chasm between two worlds. The ritual was no longer just about survival. It had a purpose. It had a memory. And I became addicted to it, waiting for the next sign, the next offering, the next piece of an unknowable puzzle. My life settled into this strange, secret domesticity. The years began to blur, marked not by calendars, but by the rhythm of the offerings and the subtle signs left in their wake. The fear never truly went away, of course. It was always there, a low hum beneath the surface of my daily chores. But it was a manageable fear, a known quantity. I learned to read the forest in a new way, to see it not as a collection of trees and animals, but as the living domain of a singular, powerful consciousness. The snap of a twig in the distance wasn't just the wind. It was a potential observation. The sudden silence of the birds wasn't just a hawk overhead. It was a signal that the master of this place was moving. I had traded my connection to the human world for a connection to this one. And the cost was a solitude so complete, it was like living at the bottom of the ocean. The bond, if you can call it that, evolved through a series of these silent exchanges. The years settled into a strange domesticity, a rhythm of survival and tribute. I would hunt, and a portion of that hunt would go to the slab. In return, I was granted a fragile peace. The terror of that first winter solidified into a constant, low-level vigilance. It was no longer a ghost story, but a complex, ongoing negotiation. I learned to read the forest, not as a place, but as a presence. The sudden silence of the Jayus, The way the deer would vanish from a clearing for no apparent reason. The unusual patterns in the frost on my windows, they were all part of a language. I had become fluent in the dialect of my own haunting. My world had shrunk to the size of this property line. And the only conversation that mattered was the one I had in silence with the thing in the woods. I was its prisoner, yes, but I was also its sole confidant. One winter, a pair of lost snowmobilers buzzed near the southern edge of my land. I heard the high-pitched whine of their engines from miles away, a sound as alien and intrusive as a siren in a library. They were young, reckless, following the frozen river, heading straight for a stretch of lake where the currents always keep the ice dangerously thin. I considered firing a warning shot, but what good would that do? They'd either ignore it or come looking for the source, and both options were unacceptable. I spent the night in a cold sweat, imagining the sound of cracking ice, of screams swallowed by the wind. But the next morning, as I made my way to the slab, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A neat, deliberate line of heavy, snapped-off pine boughs had been laid across the river path they were following. It was a crude but brutally effective barrier, a wall of green and brown against the white snow, guiding them away from the thin ice and back toward the safety of the main trail. It was an act of profound and terrifying intelligence. It wasn't protecting them. I knew that with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. It was protecting its territory. It was protecting its food source, me. Those noisy intruders were a disturbance, a variable it could not control, and it had dealt with them in the most efficient way possible. It had rerouted them without revealing itself, using the very materials of the forest as its tool. This was a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond an animal's instinct. It understood cause and effect, risk and prevention. The pine boughs were another message for me. Just like the disarmed bear trap, they said. Asterisk, this world is mine. I keep the order here. Your only role is to provide. Asterisk, the pact was not just about feeding its hunger. It was about maintaining a delicate, silent ecosystem of which I was a critical and replaceable part. Another winter, I came down with a severe case of pneumonia. For 2 weeks, I was bedridden, racked with fever, my breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. I couldn't even make it to the woods, let alone go out to hunt or deliver the offering. The first 3 days passed in a delirious haze. On the 4th night, the scratching returned. It was different this time. Not the slow, testing scrape of the early days, but a frantic, demanding, angry sound. It was the sound of a starving addict rattling the bars of his cage. It scraped and clawed at the walls, at the roof, at the very foundations of my home, a constant, nerve-shredding reminder of my failure. The whispers came back, a chorus of hungry voices accusing me from the darkness. I was sure I was going to die, not from the sickness, but from the terror of what my sickness had unleashed. Then, one morning, I woke up, the fever having broken slightly. The scratching was gone. In its place was a heavy silence. I dragged myself to the door, my body aching with every movement, and looked out onto the porch. My heart nearly stopped. Lying there, in a neat pile, was a freshly killed rabbit, its body still steaming slightly in the frigid air. Next to it was a small, carefully arranged stack of dry kindling and birch bark. I stared at it, my mind struggling to comprehend. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't an act of kindness or concern for my health. It was a command, delivered with chilling clarity. It was a transaction. Asterisk, here is the means to get well. Here is the fuel to warm yourself. Now, recover. Get back on your feet. And feed me asterisk. In that moment, I understood the true nature of our arrangement on a level I never had before. Some debts are paid in flesh, one way or another. The outside world, however, always encroaches. It whispers and shouts, even in a place this remote. On the clear, cold nights, my shortwave radio was my only link to the rest of humanity. One would listen to news from a world away airports, of wars, of stock market crashes, of corporate scandals and political unrest. And I began to notice a pattern. On nights when the news was particularly grim, filled with stories of human greed, violence, and large-scale destruction, the forest would change. The usual peace would be replaced by a tense, agitated energy. The scratching on the walls would return, light and intermittent, like the tapping of an impatient finger. It was as if the creature could sense the psychic turmoil of the human race, as if the waves of our collective cruelty and hunger were a frequency it could tune into. It was a barometer for the sickness of the world beyond its woods. It remembers what we forget. The first real threat, the one that almost shattered our fragile peace, wasn't the creature at all. It was a family of tourists. I saw their minivan first, a flash of red against the endless green and white, parked brazenly on the old logging road that marked the edge of my property. They were drawn here by some article online, a blog post about the untouched wilderness and unspoiled beauty of Last Loon Lake. They were a caricature of city dwellers, loud and oblivious. I heard their laughter and the tinny music from a portable speaker echoing through the trees, a sound that felt like a physical violation, a desecration of the sacred quiet I worked so hard to maintain. From my window, I watched them pitch a bright orange tent and start a fire, the smoke curling up into the twilight sky like an insulting gesture. They had no idea they were setting up a picnic in a lion's den. Their ignorance was a death sentence. As darkness fell, a new sound began to echo from the deep woods. It was a sound I had never heard before in all my years. It wasn't a whisper, not a scratch. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the earth. It was a deep, resonant rumble of displeasure, like stones grinding together in the belly of a mountain. It wasn't directed at me. It was aimed squarely at the little bubble of light and noise they had created. This was not the creature's usual cryptic communication. This was a primal, territorial warning. This was the sound a predator makes right before it claims its prey. The blood drained from my face. They had crossed a line, and the pact I had with the creature did not extend to protecting fools. I was faced with an impossible choice. Let them be taken, and live with the knowledge that their deaths were on my hands. A choice that would surely bring investigators and break the pact forever. Or intervene and risk exposing myself, my secret, and the creature itself to the outside world. The growl came again, closer this time, and I could feel the vibration in the floorboards of my cabin. There was no more time to think. I grabbed my heaviest coat and a powerful flashlight and burst out of the cabin door, a desperate, half-formed plan exploding in my mind. I had cultivated the persona of a madman for years as a shield. Now, I would have to become him. I would have to make them more afraid of me than they were of the dark. I would have to become the monster to save them from the real one. I ran toward their campfire, my old legs pumping, the frozen air burning my lungs. I didn't call out a polite warning. I screamed. I let out a raw, unhinged bellow of pure rage, channeling every bit of my fear and isolation into the sound. I burst into their little clearing like an apparition, the beam of my flashlight wild and erratic, catching their terrified faces in the stark white glare. I screamed at them about trespassing, about curses, about the spirits of the woods. I raved like a man who had lost his mind decades ago, kicking over their cooler, stomping on their pathetic little fire until it was nothing but hissing embers. I didn't give them time to think or to question. I filled their senses with a new, immediate, human threat. I made myself the apex predator in their story. It worked. They scrambled in a panic, shoving their gear haphazardly into their car, their faces pale with a fear that was directed entirely at me. The father fumbled with his keys, started the engine with a roar, and their minivan tore away down the logging road, spraying mud and gravel. They would have a story to tell, a story about the crazy, violent hermit of Last Loon Lake who had attacked them for no reason. A story that would be posted online, that would be told in the town. A story that would cement my reputation as a dangerous recluse forever. I stood there, panting in the sudden silence, the smell of pine and burnt plastic in the air. The guttural growl from the woods had stopped. The immediate danger was over. But I knew, with a sinking feeling, that I had only traded one problem for a much larger one. The cost of their lives was my last tenuous link to the world of men. That night, I had not only confirmed, but amplified the narrative of the insane hermit. I had burned the last bridge. The secret was safe, but it was now surrounded by a new layer of notoriety. The whispers in town would grow louder. The crazy old man was now dangerous. This event was a stone tossed into the placid water of my isolation, and the ripples were spreading. The family's story would make my quiet corner of the world just a little bit more interesting to the wrong kind of people. I had averted a tragedy, but in doing so, I had painted a target on my own back. The delicate balance had been shaken, and I felt a new kind of fear creeping in. Not fear of the creature, but fear of the world I had tried so hard to keep at bay. All the while, the deeper questions mounted like snowfall in a blizzard. The incident with the tourists had revealed a new layer of the creature's personality, a violent intolerance for casual human intrusion. What did it truly want? It was more than just food. The offerings were a treaty, but what were the terms? Why was it more agitated by the distant news of human failings on my radio or the nearby noise of happy campers than by me, a man who lived right on its doorstep? It was as if it wasn't just hungry for flesh, but that it was starved of something else, entirely silence, perhaps. Or maybe it was disgusted by a specific kind asterisk of human presence. The modern, thoughtless, consumptive kind. The kind that takes without asking and never pays a price. The encounter left me more isolated than ever, but it also sharpened the focus of my existence. I wasn't just a keeper anymore. I was a buffer, a firewall between two worlds that could not coexist. The pact wasn't just for my safety. It was for theirs. My life's work was to stand in the gap, to absorb the pressure from both sides. The price of the secret was my own humanity. I had to become something other than human in the eyes of the world to protect it. I had to become a monster in my own right. That night, looking out at the empty space where the orange tent had been, a cold realization washed over me. This was not a sustainable peace. It was a ceasefire, and I had just accidentally sent a flare-up into the sky, signaling my position to anyone who might be looking for a fight. The true shift, the moment this dark bargain became something more than a simple trade of meat for safety, happened on the 10th anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, a decade. The weight of that number was crushing. Grief, I've learned, is not a wound that heals, but a landscape you learn to navigate. That day, however, I was lost in it completely. The cold was sharper, the silence heavier, the ache in my bones a direct echo of the ache in my soul. I went about my chores in a fog of memory, seeing Daniel's face in the grain of the wood I was chopping, hearing his laugh on the wind that rattled the windows. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, I was undone. I was no longer a pragmatic survivor. I was just a lonely old man at the frayed end of a very long rope, haunted by a ghost I could never appease. The ritual that day was not about survival. It was about despair. I took the offering, a prime cut from a deer I'd taken 2 days before, and walked the familiar path to the granite slab. The snow crunched under my boots, each step a painful reminder of the 10 years of steps I'd taken alone. When I reached the stone, I placed the meat down as I always did. But then, for the first time, I didn't turn away. I stood there, a frail figure against the vast, indifferent wilderness, and I spoke. I broke the unwritten rule of silence. My voice, hoarse from disuse, was a small, fragile thing in the immense quiet. I confessed everything. My guilt for not going with him on that hunt. My foolish pride. My unending, hollow sorrow. My crushing loneliness. I wept. I wept openly in the frozen air, hot tears freezing on my cheeks, my words dissolving into mist. I wasn't speaking to a monster. I was speaking to the void, to the forest, to the ghost of my brother, and to the silent witness that I knew was listening. The next morning, I woke with a new kind of fear, a cold, hard dread that had nothing to do with hunger or violence. I had shown weakness. I had exposed the soft, vulnerable underbelly of my grief to a creature of pure elemental hunger. I had broken the protocol, not through curiosity or carelessness, but through pure, raw emotion. I expected a punishment. I expected the offering to be untouched, a sign of its disgust. Or worse, I expected some new, terrible desecration. As I walked towards the clearing, I steeled myself for a sign that the pact had been irrevocably shattered, that my moment of human frailty had been judged and found wanting. The air was still and held no malice, but that only made me more certain that the judgment would be waiting for me. cold and silent on the stone altar I had built from fear. The meat was gone. The slab was wiped clean, as it always was. A wave of relief so powerful it made my knees weak, washed over me. The pact held. My confession had been accepted. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something else. Something small and dark, sitting directly in the center of the stone where the offering had been. It gleamed faintly in the pale morning light. It wasn't a whittled bird. It wasn't a bone. I took a hesitant step closer, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs again, this time with a different rhythm, not of fear, but of stark, throat-closing disbelief. There, gleaming against the dark, frozen granite, was Daniel's silver compass. The one he was carrying when he vanished. The one I'd searched for in the snow for months. It wasn't rusted, it wasn't tarnished. It was clean, almost polished, its needle still pointing true north. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. For a frantic, foolish second, a wild hope ignited in my chest. Asterisk, he's alive. It found him. It's a message that he's alive. Asterisk, but the hope died as quickly as it came, extinguished by the cold, hard logic of 10 winters. This wasn't a sign that Daniel was somehow alive, waiting for rescue. That was a child's fantasy, a madness I couldn't afford. The compass wasn't a gift. It wasn't a clue leading me to him. I reached out a trembling hand and picked it up. The metal was frigid, a cold that seemed to burn my fingertips. This was something else entirely. This was a statement. The creature was showing me a piece of its own history, a piece of the tragedy it had absorbed from this land, from that storm, from my brother. In that moment, standing there with Daniel's compass in my palm, the entire foundation of my world fractured and reformed. It wasn't a ghost that haunted these woods. It wasn't a simple beast. It was a vessel, a living, breathing archive of the land's deepest sorrows. It wasn't just hungry. Its hunger, asterisk, was asterisk an echo of my brother's final, desperate starvation as he froze to death in the endless white. The creature hadn't just found his body. It had, in some way I could never comprehend, asterisk, become asterisk the memory of his end. The hunger I had been feeding for a decade was not its own original sin, but an inherited one. The Wendigo of the stories wasn't a monster that created hunger. It was a monster created asterisk by asterisk hunger. My hunger for answers, and Daniel's for survival. This revelation split me in two. I was no longer just its keeper, the man who paid a tax of flesh to keep the peace. I was now its historian, its confessor. I was the only person on earth who knew the story it was trying to tell through these terrible, silent gestures. The whittled bird, the compass, they weren't random trophies, they were footnotes. They were citations pointing to its origin. The pact was no longer a negotiation with a predator. It was a conversation with a living tragedy. My grief for Daniel was no longer mine alone. It was shared, held in the memory of this impossible being. I had spent 10 years trying to keep a monster sated, only to find I was tending to a monument of my own brother's final moments. The horror of that was matched only by a profound, terrible, and unwanted intimacy. My purpose on this land was now completely redefined. The logistics of survival, the fear of the scratching, the management of the pact, they were all still there. But beneath them now ran a deeper current. The need to understand, the need to listen. The fear was still a constant companion, but it was now entwined with a strange academic fascination. I was no longer just surviving. I was bearing witness. The creature was a dark mirror, reflecting the worst parts of the human condition, the desperation, the hunger, the final, lonely surrender. My isolation was no longer a prison sentence. It was a research fellowship in the most exclusive and terrifying field of study imaginable. And the only subject was the echo of my own failure, given a horrifying living form. My mantra changed. The hunger has rules was still true, but now I had a new one. It remembers what we forget. I started paying closer attention to the radio, testing this new theory. The creature's agitation wasn't just about abstract human cruelty, it was specific. I noticed a clear pattern. News of a famine in a distant country brought only the usual quiet. but a report on my shortwave about a corporation clear-cutting a forest in Borneo to plant palm oil, or a new oil pipeline being forced through contested land. Those nights, the forest would crackle with a low, predatory energy. The growl I heard when the tourists arrived would return, a low rumble from the deep woods. It wasn't just hunger it hated. It was a certain kind asterisk of hunger. The insatiable, careless, industrial-scale greed of the modern world. It was a hunger that consumed without purpose, that destroyed without need. It was a plague, and the creature was reacting like an antibody. This new knowledge placed me in an impossible position. The instinct to protect the secret, to maintain the pact at all costs, was now at war with an overwhelming desire to understand it fully. How much more could I learn? What other parts of Daniel's story, or the stories of others claimed by this land, did it hold within it? To find out would mean pushing the boundaries, breaking more rules, risking the fragile peace I had spent a lifetime building. Could I ask it questions? Could I leave it objects to see how it would respond? The scholar in me wanted to experiment, but the keeper in me knew that this was not a laboratory. This was a temple and a tomb, and the price for disrespecting the god that resided there was annihilation. I was caught between the need to know and the need to survive. That compass changed everything. It transformed my prison into a library of sorrow, and my warden into a cryptic historian. I was no longer just feeding a beast to keep it from my door. I was participating in a decade-long memorial, a silent wake for my brother and for the part of the world that died with him. What I didn't know then was that this intimate, terrible revelation was only the prelude. The outside world, with its insatiable hunger for data and control, was already turning its eyes toward my small, quiet corner of the world, and it was about to force me to choose between my pact and my survival. If you are starting to understand the weight of this secret, I ask you to stay with me. The story I'm telling is not just about me or my brother. It's about a hunger that lives inside us all. Please, like this story, subscribe to this channel, and share this confession. You need to hear what happened when the modern world came to collect its debt. Then the modern world arrived, and it did not knock. It came from above, a silent, predatory bird I couldn't see, but could feel in the sudden shift of the air. It started as a faint, high-frequency whine, a mosquito's buzz on the edge of hearing that would appear on clear afternoons, circle high overhead, and then vanish. It was a U.S. Forest Service drone. I learned later that a new regional officer, a man named Peterson, had flagged my sector for anomalous wildlife population decline. He was ex-military, a man obsessed with data, patterns, and control. This place, my carefully maintained sanctuary of silence, had appeared as a blank spot on his charts, an unacceptable variable in his equation of the wilderness. He didn't see a refuge. He saw a statistical anomaly that needed to be explained, a void that needed to be filled with information. The drone was his first probe, his first violation of the unspoken rule. He was watching, and the pact demanded to be unseen. Peterson's interest wasn't just academic or remote. A few weeks after the drone first appeared, he became a physical presence. Not here, not yet. But in town, the man who runs the supply post told me about him. A stiff-backed man in a crisp uniform with a military haircut, asking questions. He wasn't asking about the weather or the fishing. He was asking about me. He wanted to know about my routine, my infrequent visits, my history. He spent a full day at the county records office, pulling old files. He pulled the deed to my land, my tax records, and the decades-old, dust-covered file on Daniel's disappearance. The cold dread that settled in my gut was a familiar one, but with a new, terrifying edge. This wasn't a curious tourist. This was a hunter of a different kind. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried a clipboard and the full weight of federal authority. My fortress of solitude, my reputation as a harmless madman, was being systematically dismantled by a man who didn't believe in ghosts, only in criminals, poachers, and fugitives. The surveillance escalated from the sky to the trees. One afternoon, while checking a line of snares far from the offering slab, I saw it. A glint of sunlight on something that didn't belong. I approached slowly, my heart a cold, heavy stone. Strapped to a thick pine tree, about 10 feet up, was a motion-activated trail camera. Its lens was a single, cold, unblinking black eye, aimed directly at a game trail, leading deeper into my property. It was branded with the U.S. Forest Service logo. Peterson was no longer just observing from a distance. He had established a beachhead. He was mapping my world, my secret, piece by piece. A cold fury, mingled with pure panic, rose in me. I couldn't remove it. That would be an admission of guilt, an act of defiance that would only bring him here faster. But I couldn't leave it. It was a sentinel, a silent witness placed in a temple that demanded blindness. The pact was predicated on faith and deliberate ignorance. This camera was an instrument of pure empirical fact, and its presence was a sacrilege. That camera, and the others I soon found, forced me into an impossible position. An offering was due. The 3-day cycle was ending. But I couldn't walk the path to the slab. I couldn't risk being filmed. A grainy black and white video of an old man leaving a haunch of meat in the woods, for what? An animal he was illegally feeding. A secret partner. The questions it would raise were unanswerable. So I waited. I broke the most important rule. I missed an offering. I prayed for a heavy fog, a blizzard, anything to blind the lenses of those infernal machines. That night, the scratching returned. It was not the angry, demanding scrape I knew. It was weaker, more confused. It sounded distressed. The whispers on the wind were back, but now they sounded pleading. A thin, pathetic chorus of confusion. The creature didn't understand. Its world, for 50 years, had run on a perfect, predictable clockwork of hunger and payment. Now I had broken that clock. I was trapped between two opposing forces, the methodical, technological siege from the outside, and the ancient, elemental hunger from within. 2 days after the missed offering, Peterson came to my door. He didn't come in a uniform, but in a heavy-duty jacket and boots. A look designed to be disarming, neighborly. But his eyes were sharp, analytical, missing nothing. He said he was making a routine welfare check on the sector's sole resident before the winter snows made it impossible. It was a lie, and we both knew it. He stood on my porch, refusing to come inside, his gaze sweeping over my woodpile, the state of my roof, the generator shed. He asked pointed questions, his voice calm and professional. He asked if I'd noticed the lack of deer sign this year. He asked if I'd ever found remains from predations that seemed unusual. Then he dropped the hammer. I saw on the satellite survey, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. There's a large, flat granite formation a few hundred yards into the woods. The ground around it is unusually clear. Almost looks like a picnic spot. He was showing me his cards. He was telling me, I see your altar. The psychological siege had begun. Peterson's strategy was one of slow, suffocating pressure. He wasn't trying to arrest me. He was trying to make me break. He and his team began to litter the forest with the artifacts of their world. Small, brightly colored surveyors' flags appeared, marking ecological transects that just happened to cross the path to the offering slab. He collared the one small wolf pack that still roamed the periphery of my land, turning the very animals of the forest into his spies, their GPS data painting a map of movement and avoidance around my central territory. The woods, my sanctuary, were being transformed into a gridded, monitored, and quantified laboratory. The creature reacted with its own quiet messages of defiance. I would find the surveyor's flags torn to shreds, not chewed like an animal would, but ripped with what seemed like focused rage. One morning, I found the GPS collar from one of the wolves on my doorstep. The device shattered, the leather strap snapped in two. It was a direct response, a piece of escalating non-verbal dialogue between the ancient power and the modern one, with me caught in the crossfire. The pressure became institutional. Citing the ongoing ecological survey and my uncooperative posture, Peterson formally designated my entire sector a restricted scientific study area. Official signs were posted on the old logging roads, forbidding entry to all unauthorized personnel. It was a move of bureaucratic genius. He had, with the stroke of a pen, legally isolated me, cutting me off from the town while simultaneously invading my solitude with his own people. A small, temporary base camp was set up a few miles south, a collection of canvas tents, and a large communications antenna. The deep silence of the woods was now fractured by the distant hum of their generator, the crackle of their radios, and the sound of their ATVs. The buffer zone, the vast quiet space that had kept the pact stable for 50 years, was gone. The low, guttural growl I'd heard the night of the tourists became a near-constant presence. A nightly thrumming from the deep woods, a sound of a caged god rattling its bars. My moral calculus became a nightmare. The path to the slab was now a gauntlet of potential surveillance. Every offering I made was a roll of the dice, a risk of being caught on film and bringing the full weight of the modern world down on this place. An act that would surely lead to the creature's exposure and probably its destruction. They would hunt it, tranquilize it, capture it, study it. The thought was unbearable, but the alternative was worse. If I stopped the offerings entirely, the creature, already agitated and cornered, would starve. Its hunger, untethered from our pact, would inevitably turn to the most convenient new source of prey, Peterson and his team. My choice was no longer about my own survival. I had become the unwilling arbiter of who would live and who would die. I could sacrifice the creature to save the men, or sacrifice the men to save the creature. My role as keeper had been twisted into that of a potential executioner. The weight of that choice was a physical thing, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I needed to understand my enemy. One night, huddled over my shortwave, I scanned the frequencies, hoping to catch some of their radio traffic. I caught a conversation, Peterson talking to a superior. His voice was different, stripped of its professional calm. Filled with a cold, hard obsession, he was talking about his time in the military, in the mountains of Afghanistan. He spoke of an enemy they could never see, that used the terrain itself as a weapon, that left strange signs and demoralized his soldiers with psychological tactics. This is the same pattern, he said, his voice tight with conviction. An unseen insurgency, controlling the local population through fear. Blackwood isn't a poacher. He's a collaborator. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't a job for him. This was a crusade. He wasn't just a scientist trying to solve an ecological puzzle. He was a soldier, refighting an old war against an enemy he couldn't see, and I was the key to flushing it out into the open. He would not stop, he could not. The final piece fell into place with the weather forecast. A storm was coming. Not just a storm, but a historic blizzard. A once-in-a-generation weather event, the radio announcer said, with a kind of grim excitement. The same kind of storm that had swallowed my brother Daniel whole. For Peterson, this was the endgame. He would use the storm as a pretext, a non-negotiable reason to enact a mandatory evacuation. He would remove me from my land for my own safety, finally gaining unrestricted access to the heart of the anomaly. He would tear my world apart in the name of saving my life. But I knew what the storm truly was. It was a trigger. The cold, the isolation, the howling wind, the deep, disorienting snow. It was the creature's native element. It was the environment in which its hunger had been born. Peterson saw a logistical opportunity. I saw the arrival of a god, enraged and starving, just as its temple was being desecrated. The hunger has rules, and I was being forced to break them all at once. The siege was over. The assault was about to begin. The end came with the blizzard, just as it did for Daniel. The reason it stopped eating my offerings became terrifyingly clear. It had found a new, more potent source of hunger to fixate on. Peterson and his suffocating web of technology. Its ancient, elemental hunger, born of ice and desperation, was being challenged by the insatiable, data-driven consumption of the modern world. And it was rising to meet that challenge. The offering of deer meat was no longer a tribute. It was an insult, a relic of a pact that was now obsolete. As the first heavy flakes of the storm began to drift down, obscuring the world in a swirling curtain of white, the creature made its final, chilling communication to me. On the thick frost of my main window, etched with a single sharp point, was a crude but unmistakable drawing of a satellite dish, like the one at Peterson's base camp. It saw his hunger as a rival to its own. It wasn't just hungry for flesh, it was hungry for dominance. The second message was left on the granite slab itself. In the place where my offering should have been, It left Peterson's shattered GPS tracker, the one that had been attached to the collared wolf. The plastic casing was splintered, the electronics inside ruined. This was the payoff, the horrifying truth clicking into place. The Wendigo was not just a monster born of a man's starvation. It was an antibody. It was the land's own immune response to the infection of limitless human greed, the kind that seeks to map, own, and consume everything it touches. My offerings for all those years had been a form of remission, a quiet bribe to keep that immune response dormant. Peterson's arrival, his drones, his cameras, his data was a new aggressive disease. And it had triggered a violent, system-wide relapse. My pact had not contained a beast. It had merely managed the symptoms of a world sick with its own ambition. The hum of an engine cut through the rising howl of the wind. Peterson, he arrived at my door with another ranger, just as the storm hit its peak. The snow driving horizontally, visibility reduced to a few feet. He wasn't asking anymore. He held a signed order, a mandatory evacuation. He was here to remove me for my own safety, he said. His face grim and set. His eyes, however, betrayed a glint of triumph. This was it, the final move in his game. With me gone, he and his team would have free rein. They could finally dissect the anomaly, find the heart of the insurgency. As I stood there in the doorway, a frail old man against two strong figures bundled in tactical gear, the choice was taken from me. They stepped inside, bringing the cold and the smell of the storm with them, and in doing so, they crossed the final threshold. They had entered the creature's domain, and I, the gatekeeper, had failed to keep them out. The sanctuary had become a trap. The terror began subtly. The generator outside, which had been humming steadily, sputtered and died. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into a deep, claustrophobic gloom, lit only by my oil lamp and their flashlights. Just the storm, the younger ranger said, his voice tight. But I knew better. Then came the whisper. From the chimney, from the cracks in the walls, a voice that was and was not Daniel's. It didn't speak to me. It spoke to Peterson. It whispered his deepest insecurities, secrets I couldn't possibly know. It spoke of a failure in Afghanistan, of a man he left behind. Peterson's face went pale, his professional calm shattering like thin ice. The creature wasn't trying to tear them apart with claws. It was dismantling them from the inside out, using their own histories as weapons. Its hunger wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It feeds on fear, on regret, on the very things that make a man hollow inside. It began to move. A flicker of impossible motion in the swirling snow outside the window. A shadow that was too tall, too thin, moving against the wind. It tapped on the glass, a single sharp nail on the pane. The sound impossibly loud in the tense silence. The younger ranger flinched, drawing his sidearm. Peterson shouted at him to hold his position, but his own voice trembled. I understood its goal then. It wasn't trying to break in. It was herding them. It was using fear and confusion to drive them back outside, back into the blizzard, into the heart of the storm, where they would be lost, just like Daniel. It wanted the land itself, the cold and the endless white, to be the instrument of their demise. It wanted them to be consumed by the same elemental hunger that had created it. It was a perfect, horrifying symmetry. My pact had ended, and a new, more primal hunt had begun. In that single, terrible moment, watching Peterson, my tormentor, being dismantled by a nightmare of my own making, I made my choice. My life had been defined by a single failure, a single moment of inaction when I let my brother go alone. I would not fail again. I would not stand by and watch another man be swallowed by this wilderness, not even my enemy. While their attention was fixed on the shifting shadow outside, I moved to the old sea chest where I kept my emergency supplies. My hands found the cold, familiar metal of my flare gun. It was a tool of rescue, a beacon of hope. Now, it would be a tool of sacrifice. I was the keeper of this place. I was its historian. And now, I would be its funeral pyre. This was the only currency I had left to spend. My life, my home, my entire legacy, to buy them a few more minutes of life. I didn't shout. I didn't announce my intentions. I simply turned, aimed the flare gun at the dry, timber-framed ceiling of my own home, and pulled the trigger. The roar was deafening inside the small cabin. The red flare, a dying star, embedded itself in the ancient wood. For a moment, there was just a sputtering light, and then the old, resin-soaked timber caught with a whoosh that sucked the air from the room. Flames erupted, climbing the walls with ferocious speed. The lodge, my life's work, my prison for half a century, was going up in a torrent of fire and smoke. The sudden, intense heat and light created a massive wall of sensory overload. The shadow outside the window recoiled, vanishing back into the storm. The fire drove the creature back, yes, but more importantly, it was a beacon. A massive, undeniable signal in the heart of the blizzard. I had sacrificed my home to save my enemy. The chaos of the fire broke the spell. Peterson and his ranger, their faces smeared with soot, dragged me out into the raging storm as the roof of the lodge began to collapse behind us. The heat was a tangible wall against the blizzard's cold. The fire roared into the night, a pillar of defiant light against the overwhelming darkness and snow. It was a rescue beacon no one could ignore. Within the hour, I saw the flashing lights of the rescue teams, snowcats, a line of hope cutting through the maelstrom. As they led me away, a frail, confused old man wrapped in a blanket, I looked back one last time. The firelight cast long dancing shadows, illuminating the area around the granite slab in a flickering, hellish glow. And I saw it, the twist, the final, crushing piece of the puzzle that locked my entire life, my entire sacrifice, into its proper, terrible context. It wasn't just Daniel's compass that had been left there over the years. Half buried in the snow around the stone, revealed now by the melting heat of the fire, were dozens of other small, personal totems. There were more whittled birds, just like Daniel's, but carved from different woods, in different styles. There was a tarnished silver locket, a child's leather boot, an old iron-headed axe, a rosary, dozens of them, a secret graveyard of offerings and memories. My heart seized. I wasn't the first. I wasn't unique. I was just the last in a long, secret, and broken line of keepers. Each one bound by their own grief, their own guilt. Each one feeding the silence to protect a world that never knew it was in danger. My grand, lonely penance was just one chapter in a much older, sadder book. I had not been a warden. I had merely been the last watchman on a wall that had been crumbling for centuries. My final confession comes from this clean, quiet room in a state facility. They tell me I have dementia, that the fire was a tragic accident caused by my own confusion. Peterson's official report mentions a disoriented hermit and a tragic cabin fire. He got his promotion. My secret is safe, but the world is not. The pact is broken for good. The line of keepers has ended with me. The Wendigo is awake, its ancient hunger now untethered, rekindled by the taste of a new, more aggressive form of human consumption. Now, its hunger is a mirror to our own. I look back on my life, on the 50 years I spent feeding a monster to keep it from the door, and I realize my failure. I did not fail to contain a monster. I failed to convince humanity to starve its own. Yesterday, it stopped eating the tribute I gave it. And now, it will hunt. Thank you for listening to my story. If this confession has meant something to you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this warning. And be sure to watch the next story we have for you, which will appear on your screen now. The silence has been broken, and you need to know what else is listening.